If you had to pick a through line in world politics for 2022, I think the answer is straightforward. It first manifested itself as the aspirational hope of the West in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was simmering in the background in China around the same time. It sprang to life in Iran on September 16th. A few weeks later, it briefly appeared in Russia. And by the end of November, it was dominating the headlines about China. And all the while, there were notable occurrences of it in France, Canada, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. That thing, of course, is public protests. Public protesting is bad for any government, but for reasons we'll get to later, autocratic regimes especially fear it. Conflict is harder to avoid in those situations. Consequently, what China, Russia, and Iran look like at the end of 2022 may be very different than what they look like by the end of 2023. For Russia, the issue is the biggest global news item of the year, its invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps the easiest way for it to end in a good outcome for Ukrainians is for protesters to rise up in Moscow and sweep Putin from power. This is part of the intention behind the Western economic sanctions. The goal is to disrupt the economic prosperity of the average Russian and incentivize them to support potential Putin rivals. That element of the sanctions regime has not yet come to fruition, though sanctions have more generally done a good job of weakening the Russian war machine. Part of why Putin succeeded in avoiding protests, at least at the start of the conflict, was that he only used the professional army to fight it. That gave the Special Military Operation moniker an aura of authenticity, to his domestic audience anyway, and allowed him to maintain popularity at home, even as the invasion is a war by any conventional definition. However, Putin nearly caused his own protest problem with the September 21st mobilization announcement. Russia desperately needed more manpower to stem the tide of Ukrainian advances, both in the north and the south. Some low-level protests began to mount, as would-be soldiers did not want to report for duty. Meanwhile, others believed that they were wrongly called in, against the earlier guidance that Putin had announced. These ultimately did not amount to much. Part of this may be because Putin ordered the local recruitment offices to review their policies. However, the more important factor is likely where the soldiers were coming from. They were not filtering in from the big cities. Russia has not published official reports on that, but a couple of months ago, we looked at what the excess marriage rates were around the country. This is informative of where the recruits lived, as those suddenly being sent to war needed to hastily marry their longtime partners. That way, someone would receive a payout if they died over in Ukraine. Compared to the outlying regions, those rates were substantially lower in the two political power centers of Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. In other words, Putin has deliberately conscripted soldiers from the areas least likely to lead to his overthrow. Whether he can keep drawing from that pool for the rumored January 2023 conscription remains to be seen. In Iran, the subject matter is general frustration with the regime. It has been more than 40 years since the revolution disposed of the Shah and gave us the Islamic Republic that we have today. Notably, just 2 Ayatollahs have ever held office during that entire period. And although Iran has elections every 4 years, the presidency doesn't mean very much. They mostly execute the decrees of the supreme leader and act as delegates abroad. But in 2009, widespread protests occurred over the figurehead position anyway, in the aftermath of a questionable election between Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Mir Hossein Mousavi. Those protests failed, and Ahmadinejad took control over the presidency. In contrast, the proximate cause of the 2022 protests was something that would seem politically less important: the death of a single woman in custody, who had been arrested for violating hijab laws. And yet, that has turned into what might be the greatest threat to the Iranian government in its history. In China, protests earlier in the year focused on liquidity problems and a real estate crisis, with the possibility of a full-scale bank run reminiscent of the Great Depression, something that we discussed as it was happening. This reflected a major shift in the Chinese market, a place where investors have seen the possibility of unlimited economic growth for decades. That eventually cooled off. But by the end of the year, attention turned to China's zero-COVID policy. While most of the rest of the world has moved on from the strict quarantining measures that defined 2020, remember, we're back to a point where having weddings in the White House is a normal thing, China has had a hard policy against these kind of activities. A major part of the problem is that China's vaccine is not as effective as the mRNA vaccines available elsewhere. But revealing that would be equivalent to admitting to a major policy failure to the Chinese people. And so the Chinese Communist Party is stuck promoting lockdowns to reduce community spread. Or at least China was in lockdowns until a November 24th fire at this apartment building, which some think the lockdowns exacerbated, caused people to take to the streets and protest. And as a result, China joins Iran as the current epicenter of worldwide protesting. How can governments convince protesters to go away? There appears to be a simple solution: negotiate with them. Let's use Russia's mobilization as an example. Imagine that Putin's ideal policy would mobilize 600,000 soldiers to Ukraine. Now think about the generic factory workers by day, protesters by night. They will vary in their specific preferences. Some may want no mobilization whatsoever, while moderates may prefer a smaller, less disruptive amount than Putin's full 600,000. Let's just suppose that the alternative number if Putin were to lose power would fall here, at 200,000. The question is where within the plausible range of mobilizations we would expect to end up. Rather than intentionally provoking a full-scale conflict, Putin would be better off reaching a compromise. Even if the regime estimated that it would likely survive an uprising, say 75% of the time, making a small concession is still a wise idea. That's because the expected outcome of a full-blown protest matches what is currently on the table, with the protesters winning 25% of the time and mobilizing 200,000 troops, and Putin winning 75% of the time and mobilizing 600,000. The key is that by accepting compromise, the citizens avoid weakening the state's military position internationally and destroying the Russian economy in the process, and they personally forego the risks of violent protests. Framed this way, protests essentially give the masses some marginal say in governance, allowing them to push the policy closer to their ideal point, based on how likely protesters would be to win in a full-scale clash against the government. Now, if that is all that protests did, they would not be the end of the world for autocrats. Yes, those autocrats would fail to implement their most preferred policies. But a compromise is not the end of the world. They still get to stay in power. And as they say, it is good to be king, or chief autocrat, president, or whatever. The end result is some flexibility around that 500,000 troop number that is still acceptable to both sides. However, there is a deeper problem with such a compromise. Political scientists call the issue a commitment problem. Imagine that the Iranian government comes on television tomorrow and reads off a list of substantial liberal reforms. 3 of them, in fact. The protesters are initially skeptical and remain on the streets. But in the following days and weeks, some of those reforms indeed come to fruition. Relieved, the protesters begin to go home. Months pass, and eventually there's complete peace on the streets. But with the protesters gone, the government begins to reinstitute the conservative measures that the protesters had fought hard to remove. It is possible that the protesters will come back out on the streets in response, but there is no guarantee of that. Resisting a government is difficult, and yet protests have this magical quality to them. Look at how many people there are here. Whenever you have a movement like this, the masses will always outnumber the security forces. It is therefore possible on any given day for them to overthrow a government. The problem here is that it is dangerous to go alone. You really don't want to be this guy. It's a ticket to jail or worse. And on most days, most people anticipate that most others will not protest. Without the safety in numbers, they therefore choose to stay home. That reinforces everyone else's decision not to protest, and thus the government survives. The magic is in somehow changing everyone's expectation. How, when, and why that happens is more art than science. With Iran, the aforementioned single death was enough to accomplish that goal. In Tunisia, back during the Arab Spring, it was the self-immolation of a single man. In China today, it appears in part because everyone was watching the World Cup, saw that spectators were not wearing masks, and here is the key part, knew that everyone else in China was observing the same thing. Or at least the government thought that this was threatening enough to cut away from shots of unmasked fans. Anyway, the images appear to have helped shift the meta-beliefs and convince the critical threshold to take things to the streets. The point is that this type of magic is essentially lightning in a bottle. There is no guarantee that it can be replicated once the government reneges on its earlier promises. Moreover, the government will have time to prepare for protesters to resurface, which further increase the risks of going back out. Indeed, this is one of the cornerstones of the Great Firewall of China. Historically, the government does not appreciate criticism of its policies, but the bigger sin is trying to coordinate collective action to do something about it. The other big no-nos are naked people and criticism of censors. Evidently, they are a sensitive bunch. But back to the central problem. Protesters recognize that the government will struggle to credibly commit to the reforms over the long term. That 500,000 will quickly become 600,000 once the protests have ended. If the difference between the two ideal outcomes is large enough, the protesters are strong enough, and the costs of a full-on uprising are small enough, then the protesters will refuse the short-term concessions and try to take everything that they want. Ironically, the government is its own worst enemy. If only it could credibly commit to the concessions, the protesters would not feel pressed to overthrow the government. And that is why we often see violent clashes between the parties. Sometimes they are successful, and a new leader with a different political orientation comes into place. Other times they fail, and free from the prior constraints, the leader implements an even worse policy. The commitment problem is why autocrats fear protests more than democratic leaders do. Presidents of liberal democracies still do not like protests, of course. It is just that they are not as big of a threat for a variety of reasons. First, laws tend to be harder to change in democracies. Once protesters go home, it may require a supermajority to overturn the reforms implemented. In other words, trust is higher. Second, democracies are not as oppressive. If it is easy to get back onto the streets once the government reneges, then there is no real cost to pausing the protests in the first place. Third, conceding to protesters is not the end of the world. Even if doing so ultimately causes the leader to fall from power, post-tenure fates for democratic leaders are not too bad. Very rarely do they end up dead. Prison and exile are also rare. They can quietly go home and plant some trees. The same cannot be said for autocratic leaders. All the bad outcomes are much higher by comparison. Finally, there is less incentive to initiate a full-blown challenge to democratic leaders in the first place. If the protesters' preferred policy is actually broadly popular, then the masses can simply wait until the next election, replace their leader, and obtain the preferred policy the easy way. Obviously, not all protests in autocratic countries boil over. There are a few ways those autocrats can survive. One path is if the policy concessions are amenable to coordinating future protests. The situation in China might be an example of that. The primary source of contention appears to be the government's refusal to relax zero-COVID policies and end lockdowns. If China were to make a concession on lockdowns only to take it back later, everyone would be well aware of what has happened and would also know that everyone else is well aware. Such an announcement is more likely to coordinate expectations about protests, which would make it harder to renege. That, in turn, lowers the likelihood that the government would attempt to backtrack in the first place. It's not like a concession on the quality of a cake or ice cream, which would be easy to cheat on afterward. And speaking of things that are easy to cheat on, let's get back to Russia's mobilization problem from earlier. Although the recruitment of an individual soldier will be inherently apparent to that particular person, the total quantity of the mobilization will not be. And if you want to have a mass protest, you need others to think that they have a stake in the issue as well. But Russians live in a world where the official policy is a mobilization of 300,000 men, even if the true number appears to be closer to 500,000. Take it from this guy on the left. Discreetly siphoning off more soldiers is unlikely to draw the level of attention necessary to re-trigger a protest. As such, if a full-blown demonstration were to start in Russia, it would be difficult for Putin's regime to stop it short of significant civil strife. The second way is to increase mass surveillance. This is China's signature strategy. China excels in both identifying where the protests will begin and using facial identification technology to note who is at a protest. That way, the state can pay them a friendly visit later. And no, it's not going to be a fun trip to the zoo. The third way to do it is to just be way more powerful than the masses. If the odds of success in an uprising are low, then the cost-benefit analysis for the protesters will come out correspondingly bad. At that point, reluctant protesters will be satisfied to get whatever temporary relief they can, even knowing that the government will eventually renege. Related to this, a final way is to find something that will temporarily disrupt the protests. A classic version of this strategy is to start an international crisis and benefit from the rally round the flag effect. Of course, that assumes your problems are not because of an international crisis. Sorry, Russia. In any case, if you can get just about everyone to go home for a brief period, you might be able to sidestep the problem entirely and not doom yourself to a cold prison. And that takes us to our final topic for today, the seemingly unrelated Iran deal. Iran has been working on a nuclear program for decades now, and Western intelligence reports doubt it is just for research and nuclear energy purposes. In the early days of his presidency, during a 2009 G20 summit in Pittsburgh, Obama called on Iran to end its program. In return, Iran would receive recognition in the community of nations, as Obama termed it. These types of deals are common, and I would know because my first main project in the field of international relations was a book on that very subject. In nuclear negotiations, would-be proliferators exchange their weapons programs for tangible concessions. Both sides end up better off as a result. 6 years after the G20 summit, everything seemed to be coming together. Iran and the United States, joined by Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the EU, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known more commonly as the Iran Deal. There was broad consensus in the nuclear community that it was a good agreement for the United States, even if the document was atrociously formatted. This is the actual official thing, and it has tons of unnecessary spacing. Here we have subpoints that are inexplicitly placed further left than their parent. There is an endless supply of dangling headers at the bottom of pages. The font randomly changes on page 21. I can only assume that this white space on page 34 is there so we can write our own provisions. It honestly looks like a 5th grader formatted it. Anyway, I digress. All the positive progress came tumbling down 3 years later when Trump tore up the deal in May 2018. When Biden came into office 3 years after that, there was an inherent expectation that he would relaunch the process. The new round of negotiations has been turbulent, however, and never really made it to the top levels. Before the protests in Iran began, the parties had not yet completed anything. Now that the protests have started, we can safely say goodbye to further progress. Negotiations are unlikely to go anywhere until the streets have cooled down, one way or the other. If Iran's regime falls, the nuclear question becomes irrelevant by default. However, concessions from Washington at this point would give the Iranian government a political win that might quell some of the protesting. That, in turn, would strengthen Iran's hand. And once in that empowered position, the United States would have to deepen the concessions to maintain Iran's compliance with non-nuclear policies. That's something the Biden administration wouldn't want to do. As a result, a renewal of the old deal appears to be stalled, at least until the protests have subsided. And as a bonus concern, there is also an incentive for Iran to rush to complete a nuclear weapon to create a different type of distraction. It's happened once before when India was facing a domestic turbulence, and it could happen again. How do you think the protests in China and Iran will end? And will there be a larger one in Russia? Let me know in the comments. If you want to know more about the war, you will love my book that explains the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. We mentioned the Pittsburgh G20 summit earlier. Well, there was another summit back in the middle of November of this year in Bali. Although Zelensky did not fly there, he was invited to give a speech via video call, as seen here in this official picture. The notable part is that he kept addressing his audience as the G19. I wonder why. Also, congratulations to former President of Peru, Pedro Castillo, for winning our Misplay of the Week. You thought you could